Why is the topic of the millennium so hotly contested? Like, what's at stake with this theological issue?
Is the church supposed to be taking over the world politically? The culture war falls into that. Is the church supposed to be submitting the laws of this nation to the lordship of Christ? Or is that something we await in the future when Jesus returns? So it has implications for how we live out our lives as disciples.
Revelation 20 has been called the most controversial chapter in the Bible. The lake of fire, the great white throne judgment, the millennium. All these are in one chapter, and how you think about them biblically and theologically have huge practical implications for your personal life and how you engage culture. Here to unpack these with me, back due to popular demand from the short series we did, people are like, can you give me more of this guy? Dr. Alan Holtberg, New Testament professor here at Talbot. So thanks for being willing to do more of a deep dive with me on the specific issue of the millennium in Revelation 20.
Sure. You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Oh yeah, this is a treat. This is fun. So let's jump right in. I want to ask first, why is the topic of the millennium so hotly contested? Like, what's at stake with this theological issue?
Really, the reign of Christ. What is the reign of Christ? What does that look like? So we will, I'm sure, talk about the different views on the millennium. But on the one hand, one view has a heavenly reign of Christ. There is not an earthly geopolitical reign of Christ in one view. Another view has the church introducing the geopolitical reign of Christ. That is, the hope of the church is to evangelize the world, submit all governments in the world to the lordship of Christ. And a final view has the reign of Christ literally on earth. Jesus will return, establish an earthly government, and rule over the nations of the earth. So one of the issues it has to do with what's the role of the church in all of that? Is the church supposed to be taking over the world politically? The culture war falls into that. Is the church supposed to be submitting the laws of this nation to the lordship of Christ? Or is that something we await in the future when Jesus returns? So it has implications for how we live out our lives as disciples.
Okay, so the cultural war in one sense, talk to me about how one's view of the millennium would play that out with a little more specificity.
Sure. So let me just say, one of the positions on the millennium is called post-millennialism. It posits that the church will establish the millennium on earth, which is, in their definition, the submission of the nations to the lordship of Christ, and that means geopolitically. That means the laws of nations will be under the lordship of Christ, often even under the Mosaic standards. Yeah. And so, if that's the role of the church, if the church is not merely to evangelize and win souls who then individually are in submission to Christ, but actually win nations and governments and legal codes into submission to Christ, then the culture war is something the church must be involved in. If, in fact, that is not the call of the church, then the culture war takes on a different flavor. And so, other positions, amillennialism and premillennialism, would not see the culture war as a mandate of the church, or as the expectation of the church. The church not only is called to do it, but will eventually be successful in doing so.
That's remarkable to think about. This passage in Revelation 20 that we're going to get to has profound implications how we interpret this, for how we interact with government, where we expect history headed, what the reign of Christ looks like in the future. That plays itself out very, very practically. And so it's not just this distant, or I guess you could say with Revelation, future thing that's going to happen. What we think about how it's going to happen is going to affect the way we think about our lives, interact with culture in the present. Okay, so before we get to the millennium, there's a lot going on that I had read earlier in Revelation chapter 20. So maybe gives us some context, as broad as you want to go, that would help us kind of narrow down on the millennium itself.
Sure. So Revelation 20, oddly enough, follows Revelation 19, which is a depiction of the return of Christ, although that's debated as well. The question is, does Revelation 20 chronologically follow the return of Christ? And so the events that occur in Revelation 20, and in particular, not all of Revelation 20, but the millennium, that part of Revelation 20, the events that occur are the beast and the false prophet are thrown into the lake of fire. And then Satan is bound and thrown into the abyss, and it's all locked and everything so that he can't deceive the nations any longer for 1,000 years. So millennium means 1,000 years in an anglicized version of Latin.
Okay.
And then there's a resurrection of the saints. It's depicted as a resurrection of the martyrs. And they live and reign with Christ for that 1,000 years. So there's a 1,000-year reign of Christ. And then at the end of that 1,000 years, Satan is released. He gathers the nations against the camp of the saints, against the government of Christ, and is then ultimately defeated and thrown into the lake of fire where the beast and the false prophet are. And so the millennium, those events of chapter 20, is the period of time in which Christ reigns and Satan is bound. Following the release of Satan and his judgment being thrown into the lake of fire, we have a general resurrection, the great white throne judgment, as you mentioned, and then some going to the lake of fire and others into the new heavens and the new earth.
Okay.
And that begins then in chapter 21.
That's helpful. So it's in the middle, like I said earlier, you've got the lake of fire, you've got the great white throne judgment, you've got the return of Christ. This is a very dramatic, climactic moment in world history in which the millennium is placed. Let's take these three views in really no particular order, one by one. And I'm going to have you kind of explain them and offer some of the biblical evidence for it. And then I've got a couple follow-up questions. But let's start with amillennialism.
Yeah.
What is that view, and what are some of the biblical passages people might cite to support that view?
Right. Yeah, so amillennialism literally means no millennium. And amillennialists do believe in a millennium, but they don't believe in a millennium that follows the return of Christ to earth. So their understanding of the millennium is Christ's present reign in heaven. So at the ascension, Acts chapter 1, Luke chapter 24, Jesus sat down at the right hand of God and began his messianic reign. And so amillennialists would say that is the millennium. And when the church on earth, which experiences sometimes called the church militant, it's on earth experiencing a battle against satanic forces. When someone dies, they are then resurrected to heaven, and there they live in the millennial kingdom of Christ, and that becomes the church triumphant. Generally, amillennialists and postmillennialists, which we'll talk about, will argue for some of the same, based on some of the same passages. So in Revelation 16, the nations of the earth are called to a war called Harmageddon, or we call it Armageddon. In Revelation 19, the return of Christ and the defeat of the beast and the nations that are allied with the beast resisting the return of Christ is depicted. And then in Revelation 20, after Satan is released, he gathers the nations to the war. It uses a definite article there. And the argument is the war is the same as the war of Revelation 16, the war of Revelation 19, namely the Battle of Armageddon. And so the argument is Revelation 20 goes back in time before Revelation 19. So the return of Christ, the defeat of the beast, happens at the end of the millennium in Revelation 20. In the past, this has changed because of pressure, actually, from premillennialists. In the past, amillennialists understood the future hope of the saints to be an eternal life in heaven with Christ, and so it was the sort of the beatific vision. You would live in the presence of Christ and just enjoy the vision of God forever in this sort of spiritual existence. But it became clear that salvation encompasses not just the salvation of human souls, but of God's creation itself. And so amillennialists began to recognize that the promise of the new heavens and the new earth was an earthly promise, that the saints would live and reign with Christ forever on earth. And so there used to be a major distinction between sort of the eschatological hope of amillennialists and that of premillennialists who would see an earthly reign of Christ.
We'll get there.
Yeah, we'll eventually get there. Now that's not quite so different. So there are premillennialists who will agree Christ is reigning now in heaven. The messianic reign has begun. The question is has it happened in its fullness, or will it happen in greater clarity after the return of Christ?
Okay, so hopefully I understand this. The amillennial position is that the millennial period began when Christ returned, and we're in that period right now.
No.
Okay,
almost.
I missed it. Okay.
Yeah, when Christ ascended to heaven after his death and resurrection.
Yep.
When he ascended to heaven, the millennium began.
Okay.
It will end when Christ returns.
So I said Christ returned. I meant when Christ came, but it was
in his first advent.
Yes,
Yeah.
so I was like, what did I miss?
Yeah.
But got it. But the ascension would indicate his reign. So the millennium is clearly not meant to be taken literally.
Correct.
It's just 1,000 years for some period of time, whatever that time may be.
Yes.
Okay, so postmillennialism and premillennialism interpret that period as 1,000 years, though, as a whole, for the most part?
I would say there are some who do, but most don't. Most still understand the 1,000 years to be a figure, or to be a non-literal.
Non-literal number, but an actual
number.
literal reign.
A literal event, yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, that's correct. But not literally 1,000 years. It just means a long time, or something along those lines. So post-millennialism.
Now hold.
yeah,
I want to come
sorry.
to postmillennialism. So how does Satan fit into the millennial reign from an amillennial perspective?
Yeah, so the binding of Satan, they will usually point to the language, he is bound so as not to deceive the nations any longer. For them, that means Satan will not be able to resist the advance of the gospel, that the nations will be able to turn to Christ. I have some reasons why I don't think that's the case, but
Sure. We'll circle back
that's what
to
they'll
some
say.
of those reasons.
Yeah.
So Satan is active as he was before, but not as active because he can't prevent the gospel
Yeah.
from advancing.
That's right.
Okay, got it. So presumably on amillennial, Jesus will return, great white throne judgment, new heavens and new earth, still future events that are coming because we're in that millennial reign right now.
That's correct.
Okay, got it. Do you have a sense of how prominent amillennialism is today, or any key figures that maybe talk about that? Or
So key figures would be yes, it's quite prominent. Probably well, it's hard to quantify these things, but among scholars, it is at least as prominent as premillennialism and perhaps more prominent. If I include all New Testament scholars and not just evangelical scholars.
Fair.
Greg Beale, for instance, who wrote an excellent commentary on the book of Revelation, he's an amillennialist. Sam Storms is a pastor theologian who has an excellent defense of amillennialism. Those would be some prominent voices on that side.
Do we tend to find certain denominations that are more amillennial than others?
Yeah. So most Reformed denominations, whether that's Presbyterian, Christian Reformed, or other Reformed denominations, tend to be amillennial. Lutheran churches and Catholic churches often tend, and Catholic theology tends to be amillennial, although there's minority voices in those, well, and in Reformed churches as well. But yeah, those denominations, because amillennialism was the dominant Protestant approach to eschatology, well, even the dominant Christian approach to eschatology from about the time of Augustine until about the time of the Protestant Reformation. But the Reformers themselves were amillennial.
So 1,000 years plus,
Yeah.
at least. And when you say dominant, like you did a review, Eric Tanis, we're in here talking about the discussion we had on hell.
Yeah.
And the view annihilationism is like an extreme minority view. So there's that hell is some kind of eternal conscious torment is by far the dominant view. When you say dominant, is it akin to that level?
Yes.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah. So in the early church,
Interesting.
the evidence that we have from the church fathers, the ante-Nicene fathers, the leaders of the church whose writings we have. There are other leaders of the church, obviously, whose writings we don't have. But the leaders of the church whose writings we have, who were ministering before the Council of Nicaea, which was 325, before about the time the church began to be the endorsed state religion of the Roman Empire. The church earlier than that tended to be premillennial, and it was for sure the dominant voice among the church fathers. Now, there were minority voices at that time. There's a good book that argues for the fact that there were minority voices at that time, but the dominant view was for sure premillennialism. Augustine is generally credited with kicking off amillennialism.
So credited or criticized, however you look at it.
However you look at it, yeah.
Fair enough.
and that then became the dominant view. Interestingly, when the church became centralized as the state church, premillennialism, this sort of eschatological hope of vindication at the end, waned, and it was easier to live. I'm not saying this is all the motivation or anything, but it was easier to live with an eschatology that was less apocalyptic as premillennialism tends to be.
That makes sense. I'm sure there's a huge, interesting backstory here. I'm tempted to go into, but I'll let it sit. So amillennialism, just as a reminder, is that the millennium is an actual event that we are in that was kicked off by the coming of Jesus, and the great white throne, return of Jesus, new heavens and new earth are still future events. And Satan is bound in the sense that he's active, but cannot prevent the growth and spread of the gospel. Is that a fair summary?
Very, very good.
Awesome. All right, let's move now to post-millennialism. So what is it, and what's the biblical evidence people cite?
Yeah, so post-millennialism will read the evidence of what's generally referred to as recapitulation, that Revelation 19 goes back in time before Revelation 20. That is, the millennial part of Revelation 19 goes back in time. Well, some postmillennialists would argue even all of Revelation 19 and even the New Jerusalem, et cetera, goes back in time. But however, it keys on passages like the gates of hell will not prevail against the confession of Christ, that the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that starts off small but then grows into this massive thing so that the birds of the air perch in its branches. It's like leaven that goes into a lump and then eventually leavens the whole lump. They understand that as saying the church will eventually Christianize the world, that the kingdom of God will eventually, through the evangelistic and political efforts of the church, take over the world. And that once the church has done that, then Christ will reign from heaven through the church over the nations of the world, literally, and for 1,000 years or some long period of time.
Real period of time.
That's right.
Okay.
After which he will return and establish the new heavens and the new earth. Yeah. And so those are some of the passages. They'd point to the same sorts of phenomena in Revelation 19 to argue for recapitulation as well. There are some strong arguments for recapitulation. One, besides the idea of the war, in Revelation 12, it talks about Satan being cast out of heaven, and or the ancient dragon, the devil, being cast out of heaven, and he comes down to earth having great wrath, and he's able to prosecute a war against the saints that lasts for a short time. He knows his time is short. And in Revelation 19, when Satan is released, it said he is released for a short time. And so they would argue that's what leads to the Battle of Armageddon.
Interesting. Yeah. I could see that. So tell me how Satan fits into post-millennialism.
It would be the same sort of approach, that he's not totally ineffective during the period of the church. He is just restrained from stopping the advance of the church.
So are there, on this view, there's certain things we should anticipate and expect, like clear signs about when Jesus is going to come back on a post-millennial view?
Yes, and in some cases on an amillennial view. Again, there are differences of opinion among postmillennialists and amillennialists, but in general, they would admit that before Christ comes back, there is going to be a rebellion against the reign of Christ, and that when he comes back, he will put down that rebellion. So often, they will still look for an antichrist figure, although frequently their amillennialists would understand antichrist to be more of a figurative thing, or it's a view called idealism. It's the Antichrist is like the spirit of Antichrist, and he can manifest himself in various different ways in opposition to the reign of Christ. But generally, they would still be able to look for an actual militant opposition to the reign of Christ before the return of Christ. Yeah.
Who are some figures? So, how prominent is this today?
Yeah.
And who are maybe some of the key figures that argue for it?
Yeah. It's not as prominent as premillennialism or amillennialism.
Okay.
But I think it has been gaining in prominence. It used to be quite prominent, especially after the age of the Enlightenment, leading into the early 20th century, when there was a very hopeful eschatology in the church, and which generally motivated the missions movement. We're going to get out there and evangelize the entire world, and things will get better and better and better. We're moving into the millennium, and World War I and World War II put the brakes on that optimism. And so now, generally, postmillennialists would say, well, we're moving in the right direction, but it's incremental, it's up and down, that sort of thing. And it says that the church is not fulfilling its role as it should be fulfilling. We need to get out there and motivate the church to evangelism and to political activism and things like that. So it's gaining a little bit, but it lost a lot of traction in the 20th century. Yeah, but it's not as prominent as amillennialism or premillennialism. Yeah.
I think there was.
Oh, and I'm sorry, you asked me. Kenneth Gentry, for instance, he is a very prominent postmillennialist and has done a lot to try to advocate in publications for postmillennialism.
I think there was a magazine called The Christian Century, like the end of the 1800s, leading into the 1900s, and just the idea that the 20th century would be this great Christian explosion movement, like you said, shattered by World War I and World War II for so many different reasons. Okay, so we've talked about amillennialism, postmillennialism. Third, again, no particular order, would be premillennialism. So what is it, and what's some of the key biblical passages offered in support?
Yeah. So both amillennialism and postmillennialism, the reason this is called postmillennialism, argue that Christ returns after the millennium. Okay, so amillennialism, that happens, but the millennium is not an earthly reality. Postmillennialism, it is an earthly reality. Premillennialism says Christ returns before the millennium.
Okay, let me jump in real quick. Hey, quick pause. I want to tell you about a Bible study tool that I've used for 25 years. It is one of only 2 sponsors I have on this channel, along with Talbot School of Theology. Why? Because I deeply believe in it, and I've deeply benefited from it, and I want you to consider using it. It's called Logos, and the tools it offers at your fingertips will blow you away. I use it preparing for interviews. I use it in my personal Bible study in the morning, and I even used it when I was writing my dissertation. That means it's a tool that can be used by scholars who want to go deep and lay people who just want to get into the scriptures for themselves. If you want to learn how to study the Bible for yourself and just own and know the scriptures, you will not find a better tool than Logos. I'd love for you to consider trying it out. Start a free 60-day trial, which you can find at logos.com/McDowell. Link is in the description. Now back to the show. Okay, so amillennialism, we're in the millennial reign. Christ comes back afterwards.
Yes.
Postmillennialism, we're not in the millennial reign yet, but Christ still will come back afterwards.
Yeah, we will eventually be in the millennium, and Christ will return after that millennium.
At the end of it. Okay, we're moving towards it, hence society is moving, the gospel is advancing. Premillennialism, so the pre is about when Christ comes back.
That's exactly
before the millennialism. So the confusing part is, and I'm sorry to cut you off, is if the pre was we are pre the millennial, post-millennial and premillennial both agree that the millennial state is not yet.
That's correct. Yeah. Yeah. Some postmillennialists might argue that the millennium began in the first century and is slowly advancing, but often it's when the nations are submitted to Christ, that's when the millennium begins. And so you can have differences of opinion on actually when it all began. And because they're not committed to any particular length of time for the millennium. If I thought it began in the first century within the church, then there's no big deal that it's taken 2,000 years and we haven't yet accomplished what the church needs to accomplish. That's not a problem for postmillennialists.
So if I'm correct, and I cut you off as you were explaining premillennialism, on amillennialism and postmillennialism, we would see cultural changes happen either before the millennium itself and the reign of Christ, or the return of Christ. Premillennialism, Christ is going to come back. So if there are any signs, whatever they may be, and we could talk about that, it wouldn't be of the millennium or the millennial reign. It would be of Christ coming back before any kind of millennial reign. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's correct. So any view could be looking for signs of the return of Christ. But the question is he returning after his reign or before his reign? And so premillennialism says he's returning before he reigns on earth. Now, there are a number of biblical arguments for why that would be the case, not the least of which is Revelation 20 seems, as you read it straightforwardly, John just links these visions together with a Greek phrase that's translated, and I saw this, and I saw that, and I saw this, and I saw that. And they clearly, the and I saw sequence in Revelation 19 is clearly chronological. Revelation 20 just links to 19 with the same kai edon. And then those events in Revelation 20 are clearly chronological. And so you have to argue that somehow John has gone back in time when he gets into Revelation 20. It doesn't naturally read that way. Some will argue, for instance, Greg Beale argues, an angel coming down from heaven is a signal that we've made a break in the chronology and things like that. I think it's a position that can't be sustained, but that's his argument. So Revelation 20 just normally reads, straightforwardly reads as chronologically following Revelation 19. But there are other strong indications as well. So in Revelation, at the beginning, before the millennium, before Satan is bound and cast into the abyss, the beast and the false prophet are thrown into the lake of fire. Satan is thrown into the lake of fire after the millennium. And it says where the beast and the false prophet are in Revelation 20. So that suggests a chronology. And what has to be argued is, well, it just means they were just thrown in a couple minutes before or something like that, not 1,000 years before. But it doesn't read that way. To me, one of the strongest arguments, well, we're talking about he will not deceive the nations any longer. Well, everything from chapter 12 to chapter 20 is about Satan deceiving the nations so as to worship the beast. And so when it says he will not deceive the nations any longer, it suggests, like the stuff he was doing before Revelation 20. But to me, the strongest argument that Revelation 20 is intended to follow the return of Christ is that the primary subtext of the book of Revelation is the book of Daniel. And in Daniel's eschatology, which is built up over several chapters, in chapter 7, there are 4 beasts that come out of the sea, the last being this indescribable monster with 10 horns, and an antichrist-like figure comes out of this. John develops that beast in Revelation 13. It's very clearly built on the beasts of Daniel 7. That beast is burned with fire when the Son of Man approaches the Ancient of Days and receives the kingdom. The other beasts, interestingly, were told they weren't killed at that time. They were given an extension of life. So that there are some nations or some even opponents of the people of God who continue into the reign of Christ. And yet this final persecuting Antichrist-like figure and his political machine, that 4th beast, is destroyed, is burned with fire. And then the saints receive the kingdom with the Son of Man. Now, that's chronological in Daniel. In Daniel 12, it says, Daniel 12:1, then some of those who sleep in the dust will awake, these to eternal life, the others to eternal contempt. John posits a dual resurrection, a resurrection of the saints prior to the reign of Christ, and a resurrection of others that get thrown into the lake of fire after the return of Christ. And so in the book of Revelation, John is just following the chronological sequence of Daniel's eschatology. And so when he gets to Revelation 19 and 20, the Son of Man returns. He defeats the beast. The beast is thrown into the fire. He's burned with fire. There's a resurrection. They reign with Christ for 1,000 years, after which there's a second resurrection and the eternal state. And so I don't see any reason to see that John has somehow changed around that general flow from Daniel. So yeah, to me that's one of the strongest reasons that Revelation 20 follows Revelation 19.
That's great. Well, one of my questions is going to be, which view do you hold and why? You've tipped your hat pretty strongly towards premillennial, which is totally fine. But let's sum this back up for people. So premillennial is Jesus coming back, and then there'll be the millennial reign. Might be 1,000 years, or that might be a stand-in for a lengthy period of time. What is that millennial reign going to be like, and how does it contrast with an amillennial or postmillennial view?
Yeah. So there are two ways of understanding the premillennial reign of Christ. One has been called classical premillennialism. It's the premillennialism that the early church, that we can discern from the church fathers. And it doesn't involve God fulfilling his promises to the nation of Israel literally, or to the nation of Israel as his covenant people. Those promises are fulfilled in the church, and so it's sort of a more churchified version of the kingdom promises in the Old Testament. Another kind of premillennialism, generally referred to as dispensational premillennialism, although it doesn't have to be, you don't have to be a dispensationalist to hold this view. It says God made promises to Israel in the Old Testament in which he would gather them back into their land, reconcile them to himself, defeat their enemies, make them the imperial nation. The Messiah would come to be their shepherd. He would rule over the nations from Jerusalem. And at that time, God would reconcile humanity and nature. That, you get Isaiah 11, Isaiah 65, the child playing on the adder's den and the lion lying down with the lamb. And the nations would be reconciled with one another. They would beat their swords into plowshares, and they won't learn war any longer. And the glory of God would extend over all the earth. Both types of premillennialism see that sort of redemption of social and ecological as well as spiritual problems, things that had been lost in the fall of Adam. Those are being renewed during the millennium. The dispensational sort says, and it's literally an imperial reign of Christ from Jerusalem, with Israel as his nation, ruling over the nations of the earth. Amillennialism and postmillennialism, to the extent that they see an actual earthly new heavens and a new earth, a physical culmination of the eternal state, they would say all that stuff is in the eternal state. It's not in the millennium. Oh, okay. And so the millennium, in both postmillennialism and premillennialism, the millennium is sort of a stepping stone to the eternal state. Sorry, I've got too many words that I'm trying to bounce around here.
You're doing great.
Amillennialism, it's almost absolutely distinct from the eternal state. Amillennialism is just the millennium is where you go while you await the eternal state, or something along those lines. A time of bliss. You're in heaven. You're in the presence of Christ. But it's not. It has no earthly or, how should I say, redemptive value on earth, physically or socially or in any other way.
So premillennialism, Satan is bound in what sense?
Yeah, in an absolute sense. And so they would look at the statement there. He is seized. He's bound with chains. He's thrown into the abyss. The cover is locked on top of him for 1,000 years. That doesn't sound like he's limited in his scope of opposition or something like that. It sounds like he's entirely out of commission. Yeah. And I would argue, sorry to jump on there and jump on you, Sean. I would argue the point of a premillennial reign of Christ, Christ reigning on earth after his return, is partly performs a theodicy. It justifies God's condemnation of humanity, because even without Satan somehow undermining humanity, sin is in humanity's heart. And at the end, when Satan is released, people can live in perfect conditions under the literal reign of Christ and yet turn against him at the first chance they get when Satan is released. So it's a way of saying your sin is not caused by your environment. Your sin is not something external to you. It's something internal to you, and God is justified in condemning you.
So when Christ is reigning, Satan is bound during this millennium state. One of the things our colleague Clint Arnold has talked about is that sin comes from the world. That's transformed in the millennium. Comes from the devil. He's bound. But third, it comes from the flesh. Mm-hmm. But even in the millennial state, our flesh has not been totally transformed.
Correct.
So there can be and might be some sin and brokenness in that state.
Yeah, it's only those who have risen to glorification at the beginning of the millennium who have no sin, right? All other human beings in the millennium, in this premillennial view, still have sin, still have the flesh. And and so they can be swayed to rebel against the reign of Christ. And you get a picture of that, right? In Psalm 2. He rules over the nations with a rod of iron. Let's break his fetters. Let's rebel. Let's take counsel together and rebel against the Lord and against his Christ. Therefore, you better do obeisance to the Son, or lest he destroy you in his anger, etc. It's not Jesus reigning over. It's not an amillennial view, right? It's not Jesus reigning in heaven over his purified, perfected saints. It's Jesus reigning over recalcitrant nations who don't want him to be reigning over them, but who are forced to. He's going to rule them with a rod of iron, and eventually will try to rebel against that.
So it's not a sinless state.
Correct.
That is not the point.
That's right.
And if I heard you correctly, there will be some people who had died before, resurrected and glorified in the millennial state, and some people who had not been resurrected and glorified. It'll be a mixture of both.
That would be the premillennial understanding. Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
So often, amillennialists and postmillennialists will scoff at a premillennial understanding because they're like, what a weird situation. You got
And it is
glorified.
weird,
It is
but-
weird. Yeah. But, it's not the only weird thing that we ever come across in Scripture. But, yeah. But we would have to say, yeah, it says they're going to be resurrected. And yet there will also be people who are not resurrected who rebel against Christ. So, yeah.
That is fascinating. You said it's not the only weird thing in the Bible. It's certainly not the only weird thing in Revelation.
No, that's true.
Everybody's going to have to own some weirdness. It just depends on what level of weirdness and how it plays out.
Yeah.
So let's circle back to Israel just for a minute. So amillennialism and postmillennialism as a whole don't have a future role for the nation of Israel before any kind of eternal state, when we're glorified new heavens and new earth, maybe there. Premillennialism would say that there's a future role for the nation of Israel in the millennial state. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. And in particular, dispensational premillennialism. So in that flavor of premillennialism, it says, look, God made promises, kingdom promises to Israel, not promises fulfilled in David and Solomon, but eschatological kingdom promises of the sort that I laid out.
Mm-hmm.
God will not be true to his word if he doesn't fulfill those promises. Now, Revelation 20 doesn't mention Israel, doesn't mention even like what life on earth is like during that time. In fact, it goes over it pretty quickly. But we have to ask ourselves, when will God fulfill those kingdom promises? Now, premillennialists would say during the millennium. The postmillennialists and amillennialists would say, well, he's not going to fulfill those promises to Israel because, first of all, Israel lost the privilege of having those promises fulfilled. He will fulfill those promises to his redeemed people. Now, sometimes this gets into ecclesiology as well. How is the church related to Israel? But he'll fulfill those promises, but he's not going to, those promises in the Old Testament to Israel, those are very specific, very localized. No, he's going to do, he promised them a Volkswagen, but he's going to give them a Mercedes-Benz. They're going to have the whole earth, and it's not Israel, it's all the nations who have bowed the knee to him. And so they see them fulfilled in the new heavens and the new earth, and they're not fulfilled literally because, goodness gracious, he's giving them something even better.
Even greater.
Yeah, and so I would just say, well, I don't see anything suggesting that in the Old Testament, and there's nothing, in my opinion, that demands that in the New Testament either.
So our view of the millennium, we've mentioned two doctrines that this strongly influences. Our view of Israel and God's continuing promises to Israel. You mentioned one about, our view of like government and engagement with culture, how we think about things becoming more Christian or not necessarily so. Mm-hmm. Are there any other doctrines that are at play with how we view the millennium, or are those the two main ones that really kind of flow from how we think about that time period?
Yeah, I would say those are the main ones. One of the arguments against premillennialism is that it doesn't seem to have it seems to be regressive in the opinion of an amillennialist or a postmillennialist. That is, God has given us these spiritual gifts, not spiritual gifts like the gifts of tongues, but he's given us all these spiritual benefits. Why would we want to have all these earthly benefits instead, all these physical benefits? It moves us backwards. It's now I'm kind of simplifying things, but
of course,
it's regressive. It moves us backwards. Why not just come, have the great white throne, and have the eternal state, what purpose, what possible purpose could the millennium fulfill in the sense of premillennialism? And so I argued that it might have a theodicy purpose. It might justify God in condemnation. Nobody can stand before God and say, it was because the devil made me do it. It's because, my environment made me do it. No, you lived in the middle of a perfect environment and you still sinned against God. So I say, okay, it could have a theological purpose.
Yeah.
I would say, can God really go back on his promises to Israel? What does that say about the truthfulness of God? I think it calls God's character into question to say that he made promises that he's not going to fulfill. Now, again, people can argue, well, he will fulfill them in a very different way than the promise or something like that. Well, and it's kind of like, all right, is fulfilling a promise in a very different way really fulfilling a promise? I'm not exactly sure, but so it can call the character of God into question.
And this is
which is, by the way, that's Paul's argument in Romans 9 through 11. God's character is called into question if he doesn't fulfill his promises to Israel. And Paul argues through that. Well, maybe he's doing this, maybe he's doing that. Ultimately, he says, no, God's going to fulfill his promises to Israel.
So it's God's character in terms of fulfilling promises to Israel. And you mean like Abraham 12, 15, 17, 18, in terms of the...
Yeah, and Isaiah, and the prophets promising the redemption of Israel, their reconciliation to God, the Messiah coming and reigning from Jerusalem over the nations, the refreshing of the land, all that kind of thing. Those are promises to national Israel. They're not just like sort of spiritual promises to spiritual people who love God or something like that. In fact, in particular, God says, this is how the nations will know that I'm Yahweh, when I fulfill these promises to this nation that I had formerly cast off, but I'm going to reconcile her back to myself again. So to me, it calls into character the question of God. Has something to do with redemption. Is redemption merely spiritual? So in amillennialism, especially in the older sort of amillennialism, redemption was entirely spiritual. It was all about souls being saved. But in the fall, not only was man's relationship to God destroyed or injured or broken, but man's relationship to nature was broken as well, where they didn't have to work for their food. Now they have to work for their food. And man's relationship with one another was broken as well, where the man and the wife were naked and unashamed. Now they're ashamed to be naked before one another. So we have social relationships, ecological relationships, spiritual relationships, all broken in the fall. Is redemption merely the fixing of that spiritual relationship, or is it also social and more broadly geopolitical relationships and ecological relationships? And premillennialism at least argues it's all three of those things, which is more satisfying. Now, the others will say, yeah, that's also the new heavens and the new earth, or something along those lines. So
that makes sense.
Yeah.
I teach the class here in our apologetics program on why God allows evil. We talk about theodicy. I had never made the connection that you made about how the millennium, the millennial reign, could be a kind of theodicy, that people who are reigned by the Messiah, Satan is bound, still will rebel against him, whether it's in the millennial reign or when Satan comes back, is to show, in a sense, the depravity of mankind. I've never quite thought about it like that. That's a very interesting connection. This one is probably speculative, but do you have any thoughts on why, if the millennium is such a consequential doctrine, it kind of just appears so small in Revelation.
Yeah.
And there's little pockets of hints that are not inconsequential, but it feels like, and I know this is just a feeling and a sense of something that so much pivots biblically and theologically. We get more on it, not dropped in the most confusing book in the Bible, which is Revelation, second maybe only to Daniel.
Yeah. No, I would say first.
First Daniel?
Even to Daniel. But no. So, yeah, John he's not working out a theology or he is encouraging Christians who are under either persecution or at least severe opposition from their pagan environment, and also both pagans and Jews. And so it's offering hope to those people that they will be vindicated, that Jesus that the Jesus that they have confessed is cosmic Lord, is the nation-dominating Messiah who will return and vindicate them. So it's not trying to like flesh out everything to say about eschatology. It's giving a hope to those people. Now, I agree that the ultimate hope is the new heavens and the new earth, where sin is no longer present, where we live and reign with Christ forever. Where the tabernacle of God is among men. We are in the presence of God. That's our ultimate hope. And so John is not so concerned about sort of this intermediate step of the kingdom prior to that. So yeah, that's all I would say. But what
fair.
we can't do is just say, because it's not there, let's just throw the Old Testament out altogether. Yeah.
I agree with that. So it seems like the take-home encouragement is amillennial, postmillennial, premillennial. There's a great white throne judgment. There's a lake of fire. Yes, there's the millennial reign. We differ over when and how it characterizes itself. But Jesus is coming back. And part of the heart of Revelation is to trust God through suffering and persecution. Is that really the takeaway, even if people differ over these particulars, which we've talked about, do matter?
Yes. Yeah, I would say that's the main takeaway from Revelation. And if you can't, you get lost in the weeds on these different views, and that doesn't seem that significant to you, then hang on to that. That is the blessed hope of the church, is the return of Christ. However, I would also say you do need to come to a conclusion about the mission of the church. Is it to take over the world, literally, or not? Is it to evangelize and await the return of Christ to set things right? Or is it to create the millennium itself? And that's a major distinction. It changes how you engage social questions in this world, and how much hope you place in, if we elect the next president, are we taking a step closer to the millennium or not? Or do you say, whoever that president is, he's not going to fix everything. Jesus is going to fix everything.
That's a great distinction. So for somebody who says, I do want to land the plane on this one, would you recommend a book that either presents the different views fairly? I think there's probably a 4 or 5, or maybe it's 3 views on the millennium, or one that lays out the case for premillennialism, probably either beginning or an intermediate level for somebody who's like, I'm ready to take those next steps and think about it.
Yeah. I always recommend reading 3 views, 4 views books. Zondervan has great counterpoint series.
A wonderful series, yeah.
The difficulty with those is some proponents are better at arguing their view than others. You know, I'm not always impressed with
That's fair.
each of the proponents. If you wanted to read a book just arguing for the millennium, there's a book by, I can't remember his first name, Michael Vlach, V-L-A-C-H, on premillennialism, where he kind of, spends a book length arguing, engaging different views, but arguing for premillennialism. But yeah, it's always worthwhile to read a scholar advocating for their view. Look up the scriptures. Always ask yourself, are they engaging all the evidence? Is this the best reading of that evidence? But you have to do some thinking. I mean, read those books, but don't just go, I really liked that position.
Of course.
You've got to actually engage the arguments.
Or they could enroll in Talbot School of Theology, take your Revelation and Daniel class, and then you would assign it, which I took and was immensely helpful. The book is called Premillennialism: Why There Must Be a Future Earthly Kingdom of Jesus by Michael Vlach, V-L-A-C-H. Mm-hmm. He's got another book on dispensationalism, and it's also been translated into Italian, interestingly enough. Well, thank you for the time. Thanks for just breaking this down the way you did. Very clear and very compelling. And this was fun. Folks, if you're listening, you're like, wow, this theological deep dive is helpful. Do two things. Number one, let me know what other theological issues on this channel would be helpful to bring in some experts from Talbot to kind of break down. And second, think about joining us at Talbot School of Theology. We are now the third largest non-denominational seminary. I don't know if it's in the world. I think maybe in the U.S. I should probably get my stats right, but we're growing and we're increasing our faculty, increasing our reach. It's a great time to be here. We'd love to equip you theologically, so join us. And thanks again.
Yep, thank you.